you looking for a different level of truth about your challenges and struggles? Then be a part of the Yes and podcast, hosted by empowerment strategist and trauma specialist Jennifer Whitaker. Every Wednesday, we challenge conventional thinking on topics like trauma, healing, and so much more. Learn life lessons and great nuggets of wisdom from guests who've moved through their pain and suffering to discover a new purpose in life. Now, here's your host, Jennifer Whitaker.
Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Whitaker, and you are watching or listening to another episode of Yes and. If you're interested in finding out more information about me, you can go to jenniferwhitaker.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, go to jenniferwhitaker.com/podcast. There you will find my episodes in blog, audio, and video formats. And you can go to my YouTube channel through the videos and subscribe. So I hope you subscribe to the podcast. And I'd like to take a moment to welcome this week's guest. This week we have Nancy Legere. Nancy was abused as a little girl, and she kept her secret to herself for decades out of fear and shame. Thankfully, after many years of therapy, self-reflection, and healing, Nancy developed a healthy lifestyle and found lasting love, which helped her triumph over the stigma she'd felt for so many years. Nancy now shares her story of perseverance, love, strength, and courage, and proves that there is hope and a full, productive life even after a childhood trauma. Nancy, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate the fact that you're allowing me to you're giving me a voice. Thank you.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate your vulnerability and sharing your story. Nancy has written a book called Life in the Shadows, and I just finished reading her book a couple days ago, and it's a really scary experience that you lived through as a child, a traumatically scary experience. So would you like to tell a little bit about where we're starting with your childhood trauma? Nancy was sexually molested. Would you like to talk a little bit about that and just start the show?
Sure.
We start with the worst part of it and it gets better.
I was raped at the age of 7. And for me, that would change my perception of life and my new normal forever. It became very apparent to me within a matter of, from the time I went to bed that evening until I woke up the next morning, that I had done something very wrong. Immediately, I took on the responsibility of what had happened the night before. I was raped by a neighbor. He was babysitting us for the evening because of, we normally got his sisters, but I had a sister in the hospital and my parents really needed somebody to watch us for a few hours. So his father volunteered him. Usually we would have never had a male babysitter. Mm-hmm. But like I said, that it changed my perception of normal. It changed my perception of, I think, absolutely everything that would happen to me after that moment, moving on. Everything, life became different. Mm-hmm. A little bit hard to explain, but life became different. Yeah. The next morning, I was dressed, I was made ready, and I went off to school, not really understanding the impact of everything that had happened. And I think I stayed in shock probably for a long time, and I wouldn't be surprised even if I said years. Mm-hmm. Because I kind of went into a frozen state, or it just, I'm not sure how to explain it.
Yeah, well, I think you're doing a great job of explaining it. And anybody who's lived through a childhood trauma, whether it's molestation or physical abuse, or even those moments sometimes where we're just horribly humiliated and teased and shamed in front of a group of people. And what you're saying, my life just changed, and you said it, you woke up the next morning feeling different. And you even talk about that in the book, how just like overnight, everything changed. That's the imprint of trauma on the nervous system. And it is really hard to put into words because that imprint of trauma is nonverbal. And then when we try to put words to it, words fail it. And that's exactly what trauma does. It changes things instantly. So it limits or constricts our future responses to similar situations. And, in your case, similar situations could be just being in the presence of a male.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so it could, so I think you're doing a great job of explaining it, even though it's hard to put words to it, because it's really hard to put words sometimes to what we experience inside of ourselves when there is a childhood trauma. And you said that you didn't talk to anybody and you didn't tell anybody about it. Do you happen to remember like what in childhood, what your thought processes were as to why? Like, did he say something? Did he threaten you?
He did threaten me.
Mm-hmm.
If I was to say anything, he would go after my younger sister.
Mm.
And for some reason, I was always a protector to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Never quite understood why, but I always was. And my younger sister had a very soft spot for me in my heart, and I always went out of my way to protect her. So I would have done anything to protect her. So if he said, if you tell anyone, I will go after your younger sister, I would have never told anybody ever.
Mm-hmm.
But for some reason, as a child, I always thought that it was like stamped on my forehead or something, that it was obvious, and I went out of my way to hide it.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent most of my younger years, as well as my teenage years, doing that, going out of my way to make sure that nobody would even have an inkling that anything happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I kept everybody at a distance. Nobody ever got close to me. I had friends, but no close friends.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knew what was going on in my world ever.
Yeah, and those are very natural coping mechanisms. So, and again, I think you described it very beautifully. Like that experience of being withdrawn, and kind of that self-isolation that children will do once they've lived through a trauma, and that's a pattern that we hear with children who've lived through horrendous events like this in childhood. That's a pattern for them to isolate. And so I just like to point this out. So our listeners, if you start to see red flags in children in your life, if you start to see them self-isolating, or you start to see red flags in their behavior, start to ask questions, because you never know what could have happened or what was said to them. And
Yeah.
it's heartbreaking, because there are a lot of children that suffer in silence because they feel like they have nobody to turn to.
Yeah. And I mean, I come from a generation where 45, 50 years ago, that was never, ever talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Ever. It was not in the news. Nobody ever talked about it. It was taboo. Like, people were just afraid of that.
Yes.
And so it just grew.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no reason why people can't talk about it today.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the information is there. Everybody should be aware by now, because
yes.
it's in the mainstream. And my story is by no means unique at all. Like,
yeah, and that is so unfortunate. And you're right, your story is not unique, and that is just so heartbreakingly unfortunate that it's not a unique story.
Yeah, but you grow up thinking you are.
Right.
That you're the only one.
Yeah.
So the only thing that ever kept me going was that I was able to basically put away the emotional part of my brain. I was able to shut that off and operate with the logical side of my brain.
Mm-hmm.
So it became very important to me to be smart, to appear smart,
Mhm.
And I excelled a lot in school. Even in grade 2, my teachers wanted to bump me up to grade 3 because I was getting bored in
Mhm.
grade 2. I already knew all of the material. And
Mhm.
so I excelled in that area
Mhm.
until it didn't become important to me anymore.
Yeah.
But I
And
had a hard time finding a sense of safety,
yeah. Yep.
of feeling safe.
And I do want to point out to the listeners that um, children who push themselves to get good grades and to be the high achiever in the classroom, that not always, it can absolutely be symptomatic of childhood trauma. That was also one of my coping mechanisms, was to get good grades.
Yeah.
My dad even went through a period of time where he paid me for good grades. So not only was it a coping mechanism, it was a coping mechanism that was reinforced with cash. I'd get, $20 bills for A's if I brought them home. And back then a $20 bill was a lot of money.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. But I
Yes.
always seeked or looked for
Mhm.
safety. And it's not because my home was dangerous or there was fighting or there was none of that, but
Mhm.
inside I could never seem to feel safe.
Mhm.
But I do remember that there are specific people in my life that offered me that, for even if it was just a small amount of time or small period of time.
Mhm.
And one of them was my grade 4 teacher. And I'm sure she was like that with all of the students, but she had this way of making you feel like you were important, like you
Mhm.
mattered, like you stuck out in the group.
Mhm.
And I remember that one year stuck out in my mind, and it still does today, that for that one year I felt safe. I felt okay. I felt like I mattered.
Mhm.
And for some reason I took that with me, and it helped me through um, quite a few years, like just to
Mhm.
give me that hope.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that you and I chatted, a little bit before we started recording. We've both done coursework with Dr. Gabor Mate, and he talks about having that person in childhood, that safe person, that resource, sometimes is all we need to get us through. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, just that one person that helps us feel safe and helps us feel good, we can hang on to that, and that can be a lifeline for us. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. But it was
Yeah.
for me, it was for that one year. And then unfortunately I found alcohol that basically kept me alive until I
Hmm.
got through the rest of my schooling years.
Hmm.
Because being a teenager was probably one of the hardest and most difficult years of my life,
Hmm.
because I didn't feel like I was like anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. And you talked quite a bit in the book about your challenges with alcohol in high school. Or in your teenage years. So could you talk a little bit more about alcohol as a coping mechanism?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, please do.
I first discovered alcohol when I was 12 years old. And I come from a generation where house parties were a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm from a French Acadian family. So they're big families. So there's always big gatherings. So alcohol was always available, although it was never presented to us. But
Mm-hmm.
I knew it was there. And I knew that people were different when they drank. So I tried it. And immediately I noticed a difference.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't become an alcoholic overnight, and I didn't drink every day. But by the time I was 14 years old, I was definitely in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
By this time, alcohol was very much a part of my life. By the time I was 15, I needed it every day. And I also found ways to basically supply my alcohol. I was working 44 hours a week by the time I was 15, and going to school as well at the same time. And never, I always had people that were available to get alcohol for me, no questions
Mm-hmm.
asked.
Yeah. And
But
that's
without it,
a
I would have
different
died.
generation too, for somebody 14 to be working 44 hours a week. You don't see that anymore with kids.
Oh no, my God, they're 20. They don't want to work.
Yeah. So I'm curious. I mean, I know the alcohol was part of your coping mechanisms. Was the working 44 hours a week, was that also part of your coping mechanism? Not to focus on the discomfort that you still experienced inside yourself as a result of the, what happened to you, the assault when you were younger?
Probably because it kept me busy. It would keep my mind busy.
Okay.
I'd be in school all day, and then I would work till 9 o'clock at night. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, for sure. But that would have been a coping mechanism as well.
Mm-hmm.
I needed to be self-sufficient. I had this feeling that this yearning. I wanted to be self-sufficient, even as young as 14 and 15.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's come with me through my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still like that now.
Yep. And again, that can be a result of developmental trauma, that fear of relying on anybody else, that just gets into every pore. It seems like I have that
Yeah.
too. So I'm talking through recognition of that type of trauma, because I have that too, that fear. And it really is, it's a paralyzing fear of depending on somebody else. Too much. You don't want to, at least that's how it shows up for me. It almost paralyzes me, because I've had times in my life where I don't want to get too close to somebody for fear that, they're going to leave me.
Yeah. And for me to depend on anybody would mean that I would have to let them know who I was.
Mm-hmm.
And I hated who I was. So I just assumed that everybody would if they knew who I really was.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no way that I would ever let anybody in that close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
But
that's
at the
a
same time,
fantastic awareness. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
Because again, a lot of us who have lived through traumatic events in our lives, we do come to have this hatred for ourselves. It's like, why me? What's wrong with me that this happened to me? And if, the person who attacked me saw it, then other people must see it too. Therefore, I've got to go out of my way to hide this from the rest of the world. So, it's this crazy loop of thinking that, we get in our heads that just overtakes us.
Yeah. Yeah. But I remember as young as 11 years old, I used to, being a French Catholic, of course, I no longer practice any man-made religion,
Mm-hmm.
but being raised that way didn't help either, because it's a religion that's very much geared towards making you feel guilty about everything.
Mm-hmm.
And making you feel ashamed of everything.
Right.
And even by the time I was 11, the church had already shown us how to pray, and I'm pretty sure I even had to go to confession at that time. I can't remember for sure if that's around the same age or not, but
Mm-hmm.
I remember at 11, I used to pray for God to come and get me, because I found for me, it was too difficult to cope.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I ever realized what that meant. Like, I don't think that I specifically sat there and thought of suicide. I just knew that I didn't want to be there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And when, of course, they tell you in the Catholic religion that your prayers will be answered. And when they weren't, then I just automatically made up my mind that I wasn't even good enough for God to come and get me.
Mm-hmm.
So nobody ever would. Like, nobody would ever come and save me.
Mm-hmm.
So that stayed with me for many, many, many years. I battled with thoughts of suicide until I was well into my mid-40s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is, whenever it comes to complex post-traumatic stress, which the complex stress is, the day in and day out types of stress that we live under in childhood. And was your sexual assault, was that a one-time event, or was that something that happened repeatedly to
With
you?
that abuser, it was a one-time event.
Okay.
But then there was a subsequent abuse after that.
Okay. And because, because I thought I remembered in your book that, you talked about ongoing abuse that lasted for a few years.
3 years.
Yeah, 3
Yes.
years. So,
Yeah.
so again, that day in and day out, or, not knowing what to expect, because a one-off of an event absolutely imprints trauma, and it tends to imprint the trauma a little bit differently than the repetition of the cycle. So the repetition of the cycle is going to throw you deeper into shame and hypervigilance and some of the things that you've described already, with your coping behaviors, and coming to the conclusion that I don't love myself, therefore nobody else will love me, God won't answer my prayers. These are manifestations of complex trauma. And so how did you, through your late teen years and into your early adulthood, how did you survive that? Because that's overwhelming for a teenager to carry on her shoulders.
Alcohol.
Yeah.
Alcohol is the only way that I survived my teenage years.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no other coping mechanisms. That's all I had was alcohol. And I drank as often as I could. And towards the end of my high school years, I remember very little about them because I was under the influence every day. And I also remember telling people, and it was it was almost like a joke. I used to say to people, I don't care anymore whether I graduate or not. What difference is it going to make? I won't make it past 19 anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, I had set that number 19 as my, not really my goal, but to me, that would be the end. I would make it to 19, then I would kill myself, and that would be the end of it. I don't know why I didn't pick another year or any other day, but I used to say I won't make it to 19.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously you did.
Obviously I did, yes.
Yes, obviously you did. So, yeah. And one other thing I'd like to point out to the listeners is, you turned to alcohol. Alcohol was the coping mechanism that you chose. And it sounds like it helped you survive.
It did.
Because
it did.
people turn to drugs, people turn to alcohol, people turn to substances or whatever that addictive thing is or that addictive behavior is. People turn to this thing that they get addicted to initially as an attempt to solve a problem. And
yes.
And that's what it sounds, and you described it so beautifully in the book. And again, just now, how alcohol was an attempt to solve a problem in your life. And then you recognized that it was getting out of control. So obviously you lived past 19. So how did you get past age 19?
I graduated at 18.
Mm-hmm.
And the company that I was working for at the time, it was a retail store.
Mm-hmm.
And the assistant manager's wife befriended me, and she and her husband, I guess, they were going to get transferred to another province. And I guess I had been the topic of discussion because they came to the conclusion that if they didn't take me away from where I was living,
Mm-hmm.
I would die. So they offered to take me with them.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I could figure out why they would ever want me to go with them, but they offered to take me with them. And I did. Mm-hmm. I took them up on that offer. And the reason I took them up on that offer was because they were going to a province where I could legally drink at 18, unlike the province I was in, which was 19. But I would be free to drink as much as I wanted. And so I followed them. Mm-hmm. And things got worse for me. The alcohol really got out of control. I experienced severe blackouts. I would go missing for 3-4 days, but yet I knew nobody else there. So to this day, I don't know where I was or who I was with. But the ball had been rolling, and to make a long story short, she got in contact with people that had been to Alcoholics Anonymous. Mm-hmm. And she got one person to come and talk to me. And even though I certainly wasn't willing to listen or anywhere near ready to go to treatment, they kept coming. And eventually they took me to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. They tried to get me into treatment. That didn't work very well. And I eventually got sober. These people took me in. Like, it didn't matter. I had strangers that would actually take me in and offer me room and board, like to try to help me. I still to this day can't see what they saw at the time because I was so broken. Like, to me, there was nothing good about me. There was nothing savable or salvageable about me. But yet these people kept coming into my life, and they would just help me make it long enough until I would run into somebody else that would take me for the second part of that journey or the third part of the journey, and that's how it became. It just started that way.
Yeah. Well, and that's how I believe angels show up in our lives. They see us whole and complete and for who we really are, even in those moments when we can't see that in ourselves.
Oh, I've had so many earth angels. And that was one of the reasons why I also wanted to write the book, because I wanted to honor these people. A lot of them, when they will read my book or have read my book, will recognize themselves in the book, because I don't mention anybody by name. But there's so many people there that without them, without even one of them, I wouldn't have made it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, your story is quite amazing. So you got sober when you were 19, and
Yes.
you've been sober since. Is that correct?
Yes. It's a little over 35 years now.
Okay. And giving up alcohol and getting sober still wasn't the end of your story with trauma.
No, of course not, because
Yeah.
alcohol was just covering up the symptoms.
Yeah. So then what happened? Like, then what did you go through, and what did you experience in adulthood as a result of what happened to you all these years ago in childhood?
Well, shortly after once I got sober, a lot of the symptoms of the PTSD started coming back, and I had no clue what they were. I couldn't understand it. Like the flashbacks and the nightmares and the hypervigilance and the having to take 3 showers a day, and like all of these they just came back, and so I kept myself super busy, super busy. I was working 40 hours a week. I was taking courses through correspondence. I was also going to AA, and I got super involved in AA. I got my life into a pattern where I would only have maybe 5 or 6 hours available to sleep. And even in those 5 or 6 hours, I wouldn't bother even going to bed. I would just sit in a chair and I would sleep in 15-minute increments, just so that I wouldn't have to deal with nightmares and flashbacks. But eventually, the universe basically said that was too much for me. And I injured my back, which meant I could do absolutely nothing. Even sitting was a problem. So here I was at 22 years old, 2.5 years sober, and my life was out of control. My head, my brain was out of control. And I wasn't equipped to deal with it. And right away, suicide is the first thing that came to my mind. And I was hospitalized for 2 weeks in a psychiatric unit for being a danger to myself. And I was not diagnosed with PTSD because, of course, I'd never told anybody anything about my life. So after trying to talk to me for half an hour, a psychiatrist decided that I had borderline personality disorder. And there was nothing that they could do for me.
Yeah, I remember reading that in the book, and that became a really popular diagnosis to kind of throw around kind of back in the 90s, borderline personality disorder. And to some degree, all mental health diagnoses are some manifestation or another of complex post-traumatic stress. You know, when you really break down the symptoms and what they are, you know, it's some manifestation of it or another. And yeah, and I find it interesting that after such a short session with the psychiatrist, because you said it was what, less than an hour?
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
like it became so fashionable that, I think that became a fashionable term for them to toss around back in the 90s, and not really taking a step back, because that's supposed to be a more severe diagnosis, supposedly.
Yeah.
So it's crazy that, that a psychiatrist would think that they could diagnose you in less than an hour.
Yeah. And I mean, I was 22 years old. I was depressed. I had a back injury
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to die.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to talk to anybody.
Right. And that makes sense. Any 22-year-old who's, like stuck in bed and can't move, can't even sit up.
Yeah. And I was angry at the world.
Yeah.
But it didn't mean that I had a personality disorder. But
Mm-hmm.
back then, PTSD, nobody ever talked about it.
Right.
I don't think it wasn't even on anybody's radar. I don't think they even knew to call that back then for even vets. Like, it just was not.
Right. And in many ways, we're still trying to figure out what PTSD is. With some of the research that's going on, they're still trying to break it down and figure it out. Because
Well, the mind is such a complex thing. Like, you just
It
can't.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. And the complex form of, post-traumatic stress versus, like a shock trauma, which is a major event, like a natural disaster, or, like a car wreck, or a one-time event that changes your whole life, versus the little by little, the signs and symptoms of each are a little bit different. So, so, getting stuck in the system that doesn't understand is traumatizing in and of itself.
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. But eventually I got everything straightened out with my back, and I decided that maybe I needed a little bit of help, and I went looking for a therapist. And the first two that I found, there was no connection there. I didn't feel safe even in their office. I didn't feel safe or comfortable with their approach, so I didn't stay. But I was fortunate enough that I'm part of my personality is that I just keep going and going and going.
Yeah. And I love your innate wisdom. If it's okay if I point this out to the listeners, I love your innate wisdom right here, because you noticed that you didn't feel safe with that therapist. And, I think a lot of people out there will go to the therapist that's approved by insurance and don't even take a second thought about whether they feel safe with the therapist or not. And if you don't feel safe with your therapist, you're not going to get better with your therapist. You have to have that connection where you feel safe, you feel attuned. Otherwise you're just throwing your money away.
Yeah.
So kudos to you for having that level of awareness, even though you might not know exactly, like how huge that is, because that's huge. And I believe a lot of people get kind of stuck in the process of healing, or stuck in recovery, because of that lack of safety with their therapist. It kind of sends them to that plateau.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But thank you. So thank you for letting me interrupt and point that out, because I'm serious. It's a great awareness. And I'm hoping that somewhere out there, a listener is going to be like, oh, I might need to find somebody else right now.
Yes. And there's also the point too, that you can outgrow your therapist.
Yes, for
or
sure.
what they're able to offer you.
Absolutely.
And that I found out later in years as well. Like, these are all options that are certainly available. Like, you can, it's your recovery.
Yes.
Yeah. But the first therapist that I met, she was referred to me through a friend of mine. And I went to see her every second Saturday for 4 years. And the first 2 years, I never said a word.
Okay.
And she just patiently waited for me until I was ready. She knew, she could see that the trauma was for me, it was so overwhelming that I couldn't put words to it. And it didn't matter how much I tried. Eventually she moved away from where I lived, and it would be a 2.5-hour drive to get there and a 2.5-hour drive to come back. And the 2.5-hour drive there, I would go through the entire session thinking, okay, now today I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say this, and yes, I'm going to say this. And I would get there and I would sit there And as soon as I would try to access that part of my brain, there would be nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I can describe it, and I can almost hear it when I say it, was that whenever we come too close to the trauma,
Mm-hmm.
it was almost like I could hear the cement walls go bang, 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 and it would just
Mm-hmm.
get boxed in.
Yeah.
And I would have no access to it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, and even after the first 2 years, it's only in 2018 that I voiced for the very first time what happened to me that night when I was 7 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how overwhelming it's been for my brain to even access that area.
Yeah. It sounds like your freeze response was getting triggered. Because you even mentioned earlier that, you know, you went into this type of freeze response and you didn't quite understand it. And, you know, fight, flight, or freeze, those are normal physiological responses whenever we're under attack.
Yeah.
And with the freeze response, you know, as a young child at, you know, 7 or 8, somewhere inside and this is an autonomic process, it's part of your subconscious. So this is not the same thing as your conscious mind making, you know, you deciding, okay, consciously, but somewhere subconsciously your brain accessed that, okay, fighting isn't going to do me any good because this guy's bigger than me, he's older than me. Fleeing probably isn't going to do any good, I'm not going to be able to outrun him. So we go into the freeze response, which is a physiological response in the body that's, you know, similar to an opossum playing dead. And there is an analgesic component to it. So because it has an analgesic component, it makes it less painful, and it makes us able to survive what's happening to the body in the moment of the trauma. So it is almost this dissociating and kind of popping out and not being able to access the memory because somewhere you detached from what was happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it sounds like anytime that you tried to talk about it, it sent you right back into that, which again is a natural response in the body. And sometimes, so good for you for being patient with yourself, because how many people in the course of 2 years would just give up on themselves and say, I'm not going back, I don't talk anyway.
But every time she would talk, but she would still give me coping mechanisms to help with the stress and just with the everyday living. I think she would give me exercises to do and stuff, and a lot of them I wouldn't do because, and I have a hard time with that as well. Like often therapist will give you homework to do, and I would look at it and I'd say, well, now this is stupid. Like I don't understand this. Like, and if there's one thing that I know about myself is that I will never ever do something that will make me feel stupid. Purposely do it. And so if you're asking me a question about an emotion, and right away I'm feeling like either embarrassed or uncomfortable with it, I won't say anything. Simply because I will not make myself feel stupid or look stupid ever. That's just, and I can't get past that, but I'm okay with that. I'm perfectly okay with that. So a lot of the therapies, not that they didn't work for me, they just took a little bit longer. But I was fortunate enough to find therapists that would adapt to my difficulties. Because a lot of the therapists will have a cookie cutter way of doing things. And if you don't fall into that, then they don't know how to help you.
Right.
And I've had a psychologist say to me, like after she used EMDR, and I had gone to see her once, and at the second appointment, she wanted me to jump right away into the trauma and do this EMDR, and I mean I couldn't even access that part of my brain. So I was unwilling to do what she wanted me to do. So basically after that second session, she said, well, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. You're going to have to find somebody else. Like, it's no use coming back. It didn't hurt my feelings, but it was like she did me a favor. But at the same time, it was like, but you're a therapist. Like, you're supposed to be able to help me,
Yeah.
you know?
And I've heard it described that EMDR, it can be really intense. So that might be wise that you didn't actually work with her. I can't say for sure, because you never worked with her with EMDR,
Yeah.
we'll never know for sure. But EMDR can be kind of like a jackhammer at addressing the trauma.
But there's different kinds of EMDR.
Yes,
and I've
there
worked
are.
with it with this latest therapist, and it's a much softer way of doing it, and it's worked for me.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
It can take people sometimes, I'm not saying across the board, but sometimes depending on what type of trauma you've lived through, EMDR can take people too far too fast into it. And
Yes.
there are other types of therapies out there that are a little slower, that kind of pendulate. They help you touch on the edge of it, and then they bring you back out. And then the next time you touch on the edge, you can go a little further because the edge is further, goes further into it. So yeah. Interesting. And you've had a lot of self-awareness through your whole story. At least I noticed that in your book. You've maintained a lot of self-awareness in what works for you, and standing up for yourself and advocating for yourself.
Yes.
Just like, so I think that's fantastic, because a lot of times, we lose that ability as a result of our trauma. We don't stand up for ourselves. So good for you for not losing that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. So tell us a little bit about some of the treatments and therapies that helped you the most.
I can, after I worked with the first psychologist for 4 years, I went through a stretch, a long stretch afterwards, for probably about 15 years without requiring any kind of therapy. I was able to find a place, I guess, where I was comfortable and could function within my little world. But then I met somebody, and of course that opened a lot of issues that I had never thought I would ever address, because to me, I had basically decided that I would be alone for my entire life. I couldn't see myself making a connection with anybody. I couldn't see myself being open enough to have anybody in my life. And of course, I had severe intimacy issues. So, but then I met somebody, and it brought back a lot of the some of the PTSD came rearing back, the flashbacks and some of the nightmares. And so I had to consult with that same therapist again, and she made me be okay. But there was always something missing. I always felt there was something missing. It was like, and for years and years and years, I kept saying, I don't feel whole. I feel like there's something dead. But yet my life was good. I had a great partner. We had a home. I had a good job. By all outward appearances, we had a perfect life. But I wasn't part of that life. I couldn't seem to be in the moment, in the present, because that required me to allow emotions. And I still wasn't able to do that. So when I turned 50, I realized that my partner and I had been together for almost 20 years. And she's quite a bit older than I am. There's 17 years in the difference. And all of a sudden I realized that, oh my God, like, I really love this person. She's allowed me and supported me and believed in me and made me whole again, like made me into a person. And so I wanted to be able to experience every single moment with her. I wanted to be present, because I knew we were running out of time. And I didn't, like, we probably didn't have another 20 years ahead of us. So that became very important to me. And I decided that it was time for me to finally deal with the trauma. once and for all. And I did that by, God, deciding I was going to file a civil lawsuit against the guy that raped me when I was 7. And that would definitely force me to deal with it and to put a voice to it. But in order to do that, I had to build around me a circle of professional women. I chose all women that I would share bits and pieces of my story with, that would be able to help me every step of the way. And I included everybody. There was a massage therapist. There's an acupuncturist. She does healing touch. There's a social worker that specializes in trauma. There was a family therapist at the time that helped me a lot. My family physician was involved. There were so many different kinds of holistic practitioners, whether it was Reiki or anyways, I can't think of them all right now, but I included everybody.
Yeah.
And some of them I've had to walk away from and replace them with others, but all of them became almost like a big family for me, a big support system for me to be able to get through this. And that's basically how I got to this point. And out of this, the book was born, because that was the only way I could voice my trauma. That's why I started writing. And eventually everything just kind of came together. And I had no intentions of ever writing a book or ever publishing a book. But there it is, and I wanted to talk about the fact that you can become whole. Will trauma always be a part of my life? More than likely. Will I always have to deal with it? Probably. There's triggers all the time, but I'm learning to deal with them. And now I know I'm not afraid to reach out to anybody at all. I'll try anything, whether it's consulting with mediums, shamans, anything. I'm open to just about anything.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. And I love how you described that. One thing that I've said on the show before, and I want to reiterate right now, is, when we're injured and when we're traumatized and we get these, wounds to our nonverbal parts, the wound to our emotional self or our spiritual self, or, the psychological aspect of ourself, because it creates this whole distorted mindset, with childhood and developmental traumas, especially what you lived through. We are injured in relationship. It comes from another person. Therefore, in order to heal and come through it, we heal in relationship. So even putting together this team of, women that you chose to help you get through it, you created your little team, and it was within that relationship of the team that you created that you were able to get through it. So, again, I just want to point that out to our listeners, that we have to surrender into trust at some point in order to heal and move forward again. And, what you lived through makes it super hard to trust people. And at the same time, you were able to trust people.
Yes.
So again, just pointing that out, because that trust is where healing starts to happen. And you had to feel safe and, some sort of connection and attunement with these women. Otherwise, you never would have chosen them. So, again, these are all really, really, really important factors in the healing process. And so just pointing out to the listeners, that there's help out there, there's hope out there. I hope you were listening to Nancy say that it wasn't just one type of treatment that she used. She mentioned several, and she couldn't even remember some of them, which I think is that's all of our experiences. It's like, I can't remember what all I've done, because at some point we do outgrow certain therapies and certain modalities. And it's not just one thing that helps us, it's several. So, again, I love your story, and thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you. There's one thing that I'd like to share real quick.
Sure.
And it was one of those moments where I felt stupid, but I allowed it. And in therapy, over several sessions, the therapist would get me to hold a rock in my hand. And whatever negative energy was going on, she would tell me to try to transfer it to this rock. And I could never understand the concept. It didn't make sense to me, but I just kind of played along with it. And after every session, we would put this rock in a container. And after several sessions, she poured Epsom salts and alcohol in it and set it on fire. It was kind of a symbolic gesture of releasing all these negative things. And we had also learned at the time that I was going to have a contract in Yellowknife, which is, I love Northern Canada. It's a very peaceful place for me. I just love it. But I was going there, and my friends laughed, the ones that know me, because in the book I also wrote, like, here I am, going with this little sack of rocks, and I'm Yellowknife, and one friend could see, like, she laughed out loud because she said, I can so see you like Little Red Riding Hood with your little bag of rocks, on your way to Yellowknife. And but it was such an amazing journey for me, even though I didn't understand it, because once I got there, I met up with a friend of mine whose daughter was just short of 7 years old. So basically it was looking in a mirror at this little girl. And I had told her that I was supposed to go and throw these rocks away while I was there. And without even making any plans, she said, well, geez, we'll go with you. And we'll go up to Pilot's Monument. And all of a sudden, my first thought was, oh my God, so I asked her mother, I said, well, would you mind if I asked your daughter to help me throw away these rocks? And actually, she ended up throwing them all away, because I just stood back and watched this 7-year-old throw away all of these bad energies or these, and it was very symbolic. Yeah. And I left there feeling really overwhelmed. It didn't stay with me, because for some reason, again, that's the injured part of my brain, that I couldn't stay in the moment, but I can recall it at times, and still, it's still very vivid in my mind. I can see her standing there throwing these rocks and jumping all over the place and being alive. And if you were to ask me what a 7-year-old looks like, I would not have been able to tell you or even describe it. But there's that picture. And but anyways, the funny part was me kind of heading to Yellowknife with this little bag of rocks. And so yeah, there's been some really amazing parts in my journey, even in the worst of time. It's been amazing. It's been an amazing journey. I wouldn't change any of it. I wouldn't want to redo any of it.
Yeah. And that's a sign that somebody has, that's a sure sign of healing right there. When you hear a person say, despite everything I've been through, and as hard as it was, I wouldn't change any of it. Because we get to a point in our healing that, as hard as the traumas were, and as challenging as it was to live through whatever we lived through, we see that it made us who we are today, and that it taught us the lessons that we've learned in life, and it's made us wiser as a result. And because I've had the same experience where I look back over my life, and even the parts that at one point I was bitter about, I'm like you, I'm not bitter about them anymore, and I wouldn't change it. Because I wouldn't be where I am today, and I don't know who I would be. Yeah. And I'm comfortable with who I am. So comfortable with my story, as crappy as it has been at parts. I'm comfortable with it now.
But I never looked at it as being crappy, because to me, that was my normal. So it was just, and that's why when people read my book, often I don't understand their perception of what my life was like. Because for me, it was my life. It was my daily things that I did. But to them, it's, I don't know. I can't see their perspective from their perspective. I don't understand it.
And that's understandable, because they've had different life experiences than you. So they probably have a hard time seeing your perspective as well. Yeah. Even after reading your book, just like, wow, I never would have been able to do that. And the truth is, we don't know what we're able to do until we're pushed to our limit.
Yeah.
And, your story shows that. Your story is a great example of, being pushed to your limit and what you are able to do and able to survive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So Nancy, if any of our listeners wanted to get in touch with you or reach out to you, what's your preferred way for somebody to reach out to you?
I have a Facebook page
Okay.
for my book called Life in the Shadows.
Mm-hmm.
And I can easily be reached through there, either through the inbox system. And I'm pretty sure my email address is there as well.
Okay.
If not, it's nancylegere@gmail.com. So it's pretty easy to remember. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. And I'll make sure that I put links up to your Facebook page as well.
Okay,
So the
good.
listeners can just go to the show notes and click on the link and go straight to Facebook.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
and my book is available on Amazon, and every ebook retailers, major retailers also have the book as well.
Okay. Yeah. And we'll put a link up to your book on Amazon as well. It's called Life in the Shadows. And and I read it, couple hours, two and a half hours, I think.
There's only 113 pages.
Yeah. And it's written in layman's terms, which I like, because it's accessible to anybody. I read a lot of nonfiction, so it's really nice not to have the technical jargon, and just to have a story that flows, that's easily understood. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, Nancy, before we finally wrap up today, do you have any final tips or bits of wisdom to leave with our listeners?
Never give up. Never give up. Tomorrow is another day. And if you're struggling to get through today, just keep going. And there's one thing that I always like to say too, is that sometimes, at least once a day, if you come up to somebody, just look at them in the eyes and just say hi. You never know how much that can impact somebody's life. That has saved my life more than once. Just because you're letting somebody know that they matter, that you see them, that they're there. And that's really important. And that's the one thing that we so no longer do now, because of our iPhones and our cell phones, and everybody goes to the coffee shops. Nobody looks up, nobody talks to anybody. Just say hello to somebody, no matter who it is, and look at them right in the eyes. And actually you'll feel good about it. And so will they. And you might save a life.
Beautiful. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for that. And I also want to point out the little beam of light that's been pointing straight down into your crown chakra the whole time too. If anybody's watching the video, it's been there the whole time.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nancy. And for all of our listeners, like I said, I'll put links up to Nancy's book called Life in the Shadows. I'll put a link up to Nancy's Facebook page so you can easily find her in the show notes. You can find me at jenniferwhitaker.com. You can find the Yes and podcast at jenniferwhitaker.com/podcast. Please subscribe. Please listen, please share. These conversations are meant to help bring awareness about the lifelong effects of developmental and intergenerational traumas and what can be done about it. We don't have to live with this. There is healing, there is help, and there is hope. So please listen, please share, please subscribe, and please reach out if you need help. I'm here, and this is what I do for a living, is help people through these issues. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all next week on Yes and.
We have just concluded another episode of the Yes and podcast with Jennifer Whitaker. For additional resources, please visit our website, jenniferwhitaker.com. Leave a review if you enjoyed the show and find it useful. Until next time, continue challenging conventional thinking and keep moving forward.